Hello, my name is Sally Baxendale. I'm a consultant neuropsychologist at the Institute of Neurology, University College London, and I'm going to be talking about neuropsychological tests and how we test the function of the brain. There are three primary learning objectives to this module. By the end of the presentation, you'll have some understanding of the principles of standardized testing when it comes to looking at cognitive function and how the brain works. You'll understand the importance of reliability and validity when we're using cognitive tests and coming up with ways of testing the brain. And you'll understand the primary cognitive domains that are tested in both clinical and research settings. So what do we mean when we're talking about neuropsychological assessment? Well, when somebody comes to see a doctor or attends to a research project, they could go into a scanner and we can look at the structure of the brain and look to see how it's connected and which bits look right and maybe which bits look like they've got some pathology in them. But that doesn't tell us much about the function of the brain. To do that, we really need to test how the brain is working. So neuropsychological tests and neuropsychological assessment is one way of doing that. Just as a scan shows us the structure of the brain, which bits look right and which bits don't look quite so right, a neuropsychological assessment really shows us which parts of the brain are working well and which bits aren't working quite so well. And we do that with the use of standardized tests. The reason we need to use standardized tests to monitor and measure cognitive function is because it changes throughout our lifetime. It's a constantly moving target. The things we're good at and the things that we're not quite so good at change as we grow up, as we develop, as we mature, and as we age. It's always on the move. Each cognitive function develops and declines at different rates across the lifespan. Just as the brain has windows of opportunity for developing new skills, there are also normal trajectories of decline that happen with different cognitive abilities. So if we look at this graph here, you can see that on this dark blue line, it represents the development of verbal comprehension, and this improves all the way to the mid-50s, so people right the way into middle age get better and better at verbal comprehension as their vocabulary increases and they just understand how the world works a bit better. From mid-50s onwards it starts to decline slightly, but it really holds up pretty well right the way into the 90s as long as nothing is going wrong with that person's brain. But if you look at the green line on this graph, that shows the normal trajectory of perceptual organisation. So this is the ability to look and see patterns around us, visual patterns, see how things relate to each other visually. And this plateaus very early. From about 16, you're at your peak in terms of being able to use this ability. It plateaus to about the 30s and then it starts to decline really quite rapidly. And the same sort of thing with processing speed. So processing speed gets a little bit better, a little bit faster in your 20s, but that's really when you're at your fastest, and then it starts to deteriorate very, very quickly as you age into your 30s, 40s and 50s. And this is normal. This is what we expect. This is a normal pattern of decline associated with cognitive function over the adult lifespan. Psychologists have developed the concept of standardized cognitive tests to get round the problem of absolute ability changing across the lifespan. Because whilst what you can do and what you can't do changes as you get older, your position in your peer group tends to remain stable throughout your life. So if you function at the 40th percentile on a task when you are 10, it is likely that you will function at the 40th percentile on that same task when you are 20, 40 and 80, as long as nothing goes wrong with your brain. So whilst function doesn't remain stable, the position in relation to people who are your age and in your cohort remains the same throughout life, because you all change together. So a standardized test takes this into account and doesn't give an absolute score of how well you're doing on a task, but gives you a score comparing how well you're doing to how well other people your age and in your cohort are doing on the same task. And that doesn't change throughout life. In addition to being standardized, tests of cognitive function also need to be reliable and valid. Reliability tells you how consistently a test is measuring something. If you apply the same test to the same people under the same conditions, you should get the same results if a test is reliable. If you don't get the same results, the test may be unreliable. No cognitive test is 100% reliable. There are too many factors that influence how somebody may perform from one day to the next, but we want to get our tests as reliable as possible. There are four main ways of looking at the reliability of a test. One of the simplest ways is to look at test-retest reliability. How likely is it that somebody gets the same score when they retake a test that they've taken previously? Test-retest reliability may be measured over a fairly short time frame. For example, somebody may complete a test in the morning and then complete the test again in the afternoon to see what sort of change there's been. Sometimes it may be over the course of a week or months or even a couple of years. For a test to have high test-retest reliability, we would be expecting similar scores on each occasion that the patient or the person takes the test. There is also inter-rater reliability for some tasks. So this looks at who is conducting the task, who's administering the task. Is there a significant difference if one person gives the test to if somebody else gives the test? So a reliable test should come up with the same result regardless of who's administering the task. This means that there must be fairly strict rules about how each test is administered to make sure that the same people, different people are doing it in the same way. A third type of reliability, test reliability, is the parallel forms reliability. This is where different versions of a test, which are designed to be equivalent, come up with similar test results. The final type of reliability is internal consistency. This looks at the different items within a test and makes sure that all of them are testing the same thing. Cognitive tests don't just need to be reliable, they also need to be a valid measure of what you're looking at. So the validity of a test tells you how accurately it is at measuring something. If a test measures what it claims to measure, then it's considered valid. And there are four main types of validity, and I'm going to talk about these in relation to a memory test. So if we think about a memory test, we have to look at its construct validity. Does the test measure the concept that it's intended to measure? So is it a memory test? Is it measuring memory? If it's actually measuring concentration or attention, it's not a memory test. So we also need to look at the content validity. Is the test fully representative of what it's aiming to measure? We might have a memory test that is only looking at recognition memory, or is only looking at visual memory or memory for faces. That tells us something about memory for faces, but it doesn't tell us anything about overall memory or the person's ability to remember things from their autobiographical past. So we need to be very clear that the test is representing what it aims to measure. We can't use one test, just one single test of memory for faces, to make a global proclamation about somebody's entire memory function. We also need to think about face validity. Does the content of the test actually appear to be suitable to what it's supposed to be doing? Does it look like a memory test? Does it look like it's testing memory? Does it have face validity? And the last type of validity is criterion validity. And this is where a lot of neuropsychological and cognitive tests actually score fairly lowly. So do the results accurately measure the concrete outcome? So we might have a very reliable and ostensibly valid memory test, but it might not relate to actually what this person's memory is like on a day-to-day basis. So if we're interested in day-to-day memory function, we need to make sure that the tests that we use in the laboratory are actually related to day-to-day memory function. So do the results accurately measure the concrete outcome, the real outcome, how this person is functioning on a day-to-day basis, if that's what the test is designed to measure. All neuropsychological tests should be both reliable and valid. Sometimes you can have a reliable test, so you'll constantly get similar results, but it's not a valid measure of what you want to be testing. Sometimes tests have low validity and low reliability. Sometimes tests aren't reliable or valid, but what we really want for all of our neuropsychological tests is that they're both reliable and valid. The scores that we get are the scores that we're looking for when we want a measure of a particular function. Creating reliable and valid tests of cognitive function is an extremely complex and difficult thing to do. We have a number of measures now that we know are reliable and valid that can test function in a number of cognitive domains. These include intellect, IQ, attention, concentration, memory, language, perception, visual spatial function, and executive functions. These are the major cognitive domains that tests fall into. Within each of those domains, there are a number of subdomains where tests look at specific areas of function. For example, a memory test might look at recognition memory, the ability to recognise things that have been previously seen. Or it may look at the ability to learn new information and hold it and retain it over different periods of time, or following a period of distraction. Language tests may look at the ability to speak or understand language. Executive functions cover a very broad range of abilities, ranging from the ability to plan and strategize, estimate and inhibit, and also areas of social function. So when we're looking at people with epilepsy, there are a number of factors that can influence their performance on cognitive tasks, and we can broadly group these factors into three groups. So the first group are fixed factors. So these are the things that don't change, that have a more or less constant impact on cognitive function. And the first one of these would be the nature of the underlying pathology. And in particular, we're interested in its developmental timescale. So when did that pathology develop? Did normal function develop and then the pathology came along? Or was the pathology there right from the beginning and normal function had to rearrange itself around that pathology? So we're interested in the neurodevelopmental context of any underlying pathology associated with seizures. And then we're also interested in where that pathology is, which side of the brain it is, and whereabouts it is, which lobe of the brain it's in, because that tells us a little bit about the functions that it will be disrupting. We're not just interested in the age of onset of the pathology, we're also interested in the age of onset of seizures, and those don't always go hand in hand. Quite often the pathology will predate the seizures by some time, sometimes many years. But the onset of seizures is quite important because that tells us something about any impact that the epilepsy may have had on somebody's education. We're also interested in sex and overall intellectual capacity because that can have an impact on some cognitive functions. And then we're also interested in some of the factors that change over time associated with epilepsy. So these can be things like medication, whether or not somebody is experiencing subclinical EEG abnormalities when we're testing them, how good their seizure control is, what their mood is like, what their quality of sleep is like, and also when they last had a seizure. All of these factors change over time, but can have an impact on neuropsychological test performance. So we need to be aware of these factors to make sure that we can interpret the results properly. And the last group of factors that we're interested in that can have an influence on cognitive function in epilepsy are really associated with the course of the disease. So patients who may experience epilepticus, status epilepticus, or have a history of lots of generalized seizures or a history of head injuries can experience accelerated declines in some areas of cognitive function. So we're very interested in understanding how these events can actually impact on cognitive function. So this brief presentation has introduced you to the concept of standardized tests. You should understand why we need to use these and how they overcome some of the difficulties associated with the changes in function over time. Whilst cognitive functions are constantly changing, position within the cohort, particularly the age-related cohort, tends to remain very stable, and the use of standardized tests capitalizes on this feature. Tests don't just need to be standardized, they also need to be reliable and valid. We've talked about 4 different types of reliability and 4 types of validity. No cognitive test is perfect, but we try to get the reliability and validity indices as high as possible. Compiling and creating these cognitive tests is an incredibly complex and difficult and long procedure. However, we now have standardized tests of function in a number of cognitive domains, and we've looked at some of these, and they include measures of overall functions such as IQ and measures of really quite specific functions including language and memory and types of executive function. We've also looked at some of the ways in which performance on these cognitive tasks can be impacted by epilepsy. Thank you very much indeed for your attention, and I hope that you found some of this information useful.